Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Manage Retail Logistics Supply Chain Risks and with Insurance Verification. My name is Nathan Rowe. I'm the Chief Product Officer and co-founder here at Evident, and we'll be running through this topic today. So we'll start off with a little bit of a look back. Obviously, 2020 was a pretty crazy year for all involved, the world, and there were some pretty significant changes that happened as a result. And we'll kind of start with that as a bit of a baseline and understanding how that's impacted, a number of different areas where, from a risk standpoint, things are quite different than they had been prior. So, it goes without saying, everyone globally was impacted by the pandemic, and that had, not just to our personal lives, but clearly from a business standpoint, had very significant impacts that we're still, still dealing with, and will likely continue to deal with in the future. Climate change continues to be a topic of conversation, and then civil unrest, both here in the U.S. as well as globally, continue to be a bit of a challenge. And when we look at these are very fundamental to what had happened, what goes on from a risk standpoint and how we deal with it, not only from consumer behavior, but also from a business world and things like supply chain or availability of transportation. We've heard much about shortages of workers in certain areas. As we think about the different impacts to retail, they are very significant and very quantifiable. So, we start off with the impact to supply chain, and from a survey that was done, one of the highest areas for investment priority was supply chain resiliency, and I think we experienced this very significantly across the board, with various retailers, whether it was as mentioned, both just getting goods shipped across. We keep hearing stories about the cost of a container on a container ship has gone up X number of 100%, year over year type of situation. So obviously it's much more expensive to get goods. The goods are delayed. Then when they get here in the U.S., you have problems with just having availability of truckers and the workforce to, operate the vehicles and get transport goods, from wherever they're produced all the way over to the retail establishment, or a distribution warehouse. There's just significant challenges coming in. So it's not entirely surprising that we see, this being so high on the list, and diversification, means many things, but it ultimately creates a double-edged sword because it likely means expanding the number of vendors, the number of suppliers that you're likely having to interface with. And because of that, because you're dealing with more organizations, we'll go into it in a couple of slides, some of the risks with onboarding these organizations virtually. But because of that, you do start to open up to this concept of vicarious liability. So for those of you that might not be familiar, I know we have a bit of a mixed audience. I'm sure we have some people that know this very, very close to the heart, that others that don't. Vicarious liability is the concept where the actions of one party, they can cause you a problem. So in the fact that you may be held responsible because of the actions of another party. In effect, that's probably a better way to state it. So if we walk through kind of a quick incident here, we've got a case where there was an accident that happened. So you had a delivery driver, maybe hit somebody in a parking lot of one of your stores. That could be viewed as your problem. Because they were associated with your business and in your store, because there was an injury that resulted from it. So that's kind of an example. So not that the delivery driver was your employee or even associated with your company outside of being, a supplier, but that liability does start to flow down and ends up being your problem and something that you have to deal with from a risk standpoint. So we see this coming up excuse me, more and more as we're moving forward with just kind of the evolution of the nature of interactions and what's happening, especially as more of this type of work gets outsourced. And even from your suppliers, it may be that the delivery driver themselves are outsourced from the supplier who you have the former relationship with. So there ends up being this pretty complex web of relationships. And from the injured party, they may view it as your problem. That's all they know. That's the brand that they are familiar with, and they're not familiar with your supply chain or vendor network that you have, working behind the scenes to support your goods and your services. So when we take a step back and we start to think about why insurance verification matters, we'll start with just kind of the evolution. So very, very common to think about when you onboard a supplier from a risk standpoint. You're going through a number of different things that you're going to do vetting and validate that they actually meet your qualifications, your policy outside of just the contractual terms. Whether that might be licenses and certifications. Say they were a producer of organic goods and you needed to check that. Say that they were a manufacturing facility for a OEM style of product that you're making, you need to very carefully be going out and you need to very carefully be going out and working on making sure that they match the safety requirements that you have, because as we've seen repeatedly via news stories, that manufacturing issues that happen are not typically associated with the manufacturer. They're going to be typically associated with more the household brand that's well known and well understood. It's a way for the news media and the press to help draw attention, because there's going to be much more empathy with the known entity versus the unknown entity there. And as these organizations are trying to enforce social change, that's a way to make that happen. Clearly, security questionnaires are becoming more and more important. Even if your relationship with the supplier or vendor, doesn't necessarily involve, a technology style integration, because it's more product delivery and things like that. The proprietary information that vendor, that supplier has, likely could be at risk, and making sure that they're doing their good security hygiene to protect and keep the data safe, ends up being important as well. So there's, these are a couple examples. There's a handful more on here of just the very traditional things that you would do as you're vetting, these requirements of these suppliers. But one area that we actually see, underserved is actually verifying the insurance. It's not uncommon for the contracts or the agreements that are in place, with these vendors or these suppliers to have insurance requirements. But I think where we struggle a bit more is actually vetting that those are in place and that those are satisfactory to whatever the agreement actually is. Clearly, there's nothing that enforces that from a contractual standpoint, that they're going to go make changes or augment insurance where they might have gaps. And insurance verification comes in as effectively a way to help cover risk that's outside of these other more traditional type of areas, that either is unpredicted, in the case of the accident that we had described earlier, or in the case that there was a different type of incident that might need to be considered, and really making sure that there is fallback risk, that you're able to transfer that risk, because you are confident that, when the supplier was at fault, there is going to be an insurance policy that sits behind it that would be able to have that risk transferred to it. So, this concept is obviously very well in line with these other mitigations. All of these things that are doing are meant to, assess and mitigate risk. But, at the end of the day, doing this additional step of insurance verification is just another part of, what could be a very modern, very standard onboarding process as, new suppliers are brought into the mix, and making sure that you yourself are not taking in this risk, especially when you might have the vicarious risk factor that comes in and needs to be considered. So then the question is, well, why verify insurance, right? Most people are going to be honest. Most people are going to do what they want, and I think that's fair. I think we all generally are good actors in the world. Not 100% the case, but in general that's true, and that is something that you can count on. But it's not 100% true, and it's not something that you can fully count on. So there's really kind of two dimensions or three dimensions here. The first I would start with is the fact that the nuance of what your requirements are from an insurance may not be fully understood or grasped by your supplier or vendor. So say you set out 10 different requirements. They take a quick look, they get kind of the high points, they say, hey, we're good, we don't have to actually verify it. They may not know that they're not compliant just because of the subject matter or the specific coverage criteria that you're interested in falls outside of what they have a high degree of familiarity with. So you kind of have a dimension of that happening and coming into play here, where you may not have a bad actor necessarily, but you may have someone that's honestly believing that they're compliant, and in fact are not. They don't have a specific coverage, and the last place that you want to find that out is when you need to rely on that coverage for an incident or a loss that's happened. But I think that's obviously one dimension as we look at the motivation of the supplier, the interaction that might happen. But the other dimension here to consider is for just the natural things that happen. We quite frankly live in a highly society. We know that bad things are going to happen. That's why there's risk mitigation, there's insurance policies in place. And you really need to make sure that those insurance policies are in place, right? So, for most risk managers, this is not a question of if, it's a question of when, and doing everything you can to make sure that, you do have the right things in place. So when it happens, again, not a question of if, but a question of when, that you do have the right insurance in place to be able to fall back when something goes wrong. And it's really just trying to make sure that you're kind of buttoned up on your side. And that's everything from having the COI that you can reference to going and just making sure that COI displays the right level and the right amounts of insurance that you're expecting, that specific entity to have at the end of the day. So if we take another step back and we start to look at some of the other trends in late 2020, we definitely have seen increases in the premiums associated with excess liability. And it's very much tied to the litigious society. There's just more and more of this is happening. There's more risk, there's more policy or more claims that are happening. So obviously the carriers and the insurers are working to make sure that they're covering, and be able to pay that out. Cyber is happening. I mean, it's not been quiet here recently, and certainly in the U.S. as far as cyber risk or cyber breaches happening, and impacting us very directly. And certainly the market for D&O has increased more than 44%. So you just see these like general trends, which all point back to more claims associated with these types of policies. These prices are increasing because the risk is increasing, and with the increased risk, there's obviously going to be more claims. So like there's really good data to suggest where some of these challenges are happening and what some of the problems are associated with it. So this concept of social inflation is coming more and more prevalent, where because it's more acceptable for individuals to sue the retailers versus the third parties, that you do have, whether it's the the cyber issue happening, or whether it's the excess or umbrella coverage happening, you do have those being called on more and more frequently. And I think why this is important is that this is typically the policies. Again, this is a blanket statement, not meant to cover all cases, and certainly not meant to offer legal advice. But because when these things happen, they draw down on these policies, you end up with a situation where they're what you have to make the claim against, and that in itself is going to be the primary reason why these premiums are going up for these different policies. So there's then kind of the dimension that we briefly touched on is why is this really a problem? And the reality is that most of the third parties, and again, that's generic term for the supplier, the vendors that you interact with, do not carry the proper coverage to meet the requirements. Obviously compliance in this case is not binary, just as risk is not a binary thing. It's going to be on a scale. But the result is that you generally have less than half of the suppliers actually satisfying 100% of the requirements that you have out there. And this obviously is very challenging with these claims happening more frequently. And again, the last time that you want to find out that a particular vendor supplier doesn't have the insurance that you expect them to is when there's a loss and when you need to call on that. So this is definitely one of those risk mitigation techniques about being proactive, having the understanding, having the visibility, so you yourself can then start to make the right decisions as far as getting down into what are the different actions that we're going to need to take with interacting with the suppliers and the vendors that we have as part of our network. And it doesn't mean that there's just no relationship, but someone that you may not have compliance or maybe underinsured in areas that are going to be important to you, you may end the relationship. So it certainly doesn't have to be that way, but you may have cases where it's a risk call and the risk is just not worth it given the type of relationship that you have and that you're going to terminate the relationship. There's a lot of gradients though. You may also have cases where you're interfacing and you're limiting the type of business, or you're limiting the amount of business that you'll give them based on where they are, what insurance coverages that they do have. So if we take a step back and we look at surveys of data that we've done, or surveys of our insurance compliancy that we've done the analysis on, we really have a problem as far as being very widespread. So the type of issues that are out there. Insufficient coverage, by far the primary reason that there's coverage gaps that exist. So you start to look at whether they don't have a type of coverage, or whether they don't have a specific amount of coverage that's needed. You end up with a good number of different situations where that's the case, where I am looking at this and I see that, okay, you have the coverage, you have a GL policy, but I require X number of million and you only have 500,000 of aggregate coverage. Well, that's clearly going to be insufficient coverage, but you also have perfectly set of cases where the coverage just doesn't exist. Like maybe you require workers' comp, and for whatever reason, the vendor doesn't have workers' comp. Again, in a risk world, this is often not binary, and we understand that very closely, that as you're thinking about what to do about some of these gaps, it's going to be very situational, and that the decisions that you make will be related to the relationship and the risk that you're exposed to associated with that vendor. The second category that we've got is exceptions. So the case that you've got is that might be insufficient coverage, might be another gap. But the business is making a calculated decision that the risk that I'm incurring by associating myself with the vendor or doing business with this vendor or supplier is actually acceptable given the amount of coverage they have. So, think of this as effectively going ahead and doing, an override and saying, I'm going to be okay with this case. And we see a lot of variance as far as how that gets implemented. Some customers are saying, I'm going to give you a one-time exception. You have 60 days to rectify it. And some are saying, no, I understand your business is, the type of relationship I have with your business doesn't actually require this type of insurance. I'm giving you a permanent exception for this case. So you end up with kind of a little bit of a variation there. Can't meet requirements. So, you have a case where someone was previously compliant and they no longer are compliant. We see instances where policies just aren't renewed. And that may reflect the stability of a business, or that may reflect, any number of different motivations. But that's one example where, I went from having a good, healthy relationship to ongoing. And I think that really points out that a one-time check of the insurance for this vendor supplier at time of onboarding ends up being wholly insufficient, because you do have these very natural motions where a company may go get a different policy with a different broker, a different carrier, and you're picking up the phone and kind of trying to chase that down. If all you have is the policy on record for 2 years ago, it may not actually be up to date and current. Like they may not have information for you. So, again, in the case that there's a loss, this is the very worst time that you want to reflect, something like that. And then, a fourth case, which is very directly related to exceptions, is that the third party has chosen not to purchase a coverage that's needed. And this could very easily be instances where coverages come into play that just aren't applicable to them. But the business is unwilling to say, this is an acceptable risk for us. We can't make this exception. It's going to be too subjective or too arbitrary, and we have to, be able to defend it from a risk standpoint. And it, leaves us open for mistakes. We're not going to allow it. So, a lot of that goes to your own situation as a company and what you're doing associated with how you're managing that risk when there are gaps in coverage out there, and what the situation is. But, what's really important is to know that they won't meet the requirements. So, it's not that they don't have it, but they're actively not willing to go add the coverage or augment their policy to be, to satisfy your requirements. But also the reasons why. Again, a lot of those cases that we've seen, are understandably made into exceptions and allowed to continue to be part of the network, because that risk just either isn't applicable to the type of relationship, or the risk is minimal and it's accepted for one reason or another. So again, very, very situational in those cases that may happen. So, a lot of different reasons out there that you'll start to find, for why there may be a compliance gap. So, anyone that's is familiar with The Office would know the kind of the quote here and the title of the original side, The Office, the TV show. But when it's win-win-win situation at the end of the day. So when we take a step back and we think about a program in place that would allow us to go through and do the third-party insurance verification, there's really 6 different steps that we think about. Number 1 is clearly identifying and communicating the insurance requirements to third parties. So, what we've often found, through interactions is that there's cases where the requirements are ultra clear. They're listed in a bulletized list, and they're in language that's going to be more common and more familiar to people, and they can go, easily understand and comprehend and work with their brokers to make sure that they do have the right requirements in place. But we do see it's not uncommon for us to run into situations where the coverage described is in language that looks much more like legalese, and for a smaller company or supplier that might not have that level of familiarity, it's a lot harder for them to parse and make sure that they are being compliant. So step 1 is just kind of take a step back and think about your vendor onboarding journey as you're managing risk, and what you can do to make that as simple and friction free as possible. I know that's not often a topic that's brought up associated with risk management, but clearly if things are easy, you're just naturally going to get more compliance, and that customer journey or customer experience is probably the right lens to put on it. We don't think about suppliers or vendors necessarily as customers, but we do want to think about it as more of a customer type journey where it is easy. The steps are clear, the information's obvious, and someone's not having to go kind of reverse engineer what they need from a insurance compliance requirement. Once they're kind of in a form that can be communicated clearly, making sure that is clear, whether that's part of a contract, or more often than not, more of a follow-up that happens where those requirements are set forth clearly, and that they're communicated in a way that is more of a kind of reminder or an update, especially if stuff changes. As you start to do your more in-depth risk analysis, you may understand that there's different assessments that happen, or as the business evolves, right? What the amount of risk that you can tolerate one day may not be the same amount of risk as the business continues to grow and expand, or get into new areas that bring on a different type of risk, different type of liability. So once the requirements are out there, having your supplier or vendor clearly communicate them to their broker and make sure that their broker is understands them first, but then between step 3 and step 4, produces proof, which most commonly in the insurance industry is going to be a form of certificate of insurance that reflects that they actually have the coverages that are listed. And then as you take that proof in, making sure that when there's cases that they're not compliant, they don't meet the requirements, that you're giving them an opportunity to go back and correct them. So, somewhat, of a cycle here, because we, again, think about the journey there. It's not simply just telling them that they don't meet the requirements, go figure it out, but giving them the breadcrumbs to say specifically what isn't met, where the specific gaps or concerns are, and then having the right process where those things can come back and be taken in. And then finally, as step 6, which we had mentioned previously, is around collecting the data on an ongoing basis. So it's not a one-time thing as the insurance policy goes through a renewal cycle because there's an expiration. Or if you have a notice of cancellation that comes in, that you're set up to go collect and manage that process and make sure that you've got the right and latest insurance in tow here. So just as far as best practices, again, this very much focused on kind of thinking about this as a customer journey, as an onboarding process, and making sure it's simple, but simplify the requirements, right? It's very, very easy to, sit from a legal and a risk standpoint and put, very high level things out there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those, lofty goals or very stringent compliance requirements are realistic. It may not be that, you have a business that's able to comply or willing to comply because the requirements are, too big or too onerous or cost too much for, the type of relationship or the revenue that supplier would get via engagement, with you. Prioritize this as part of your operation. So, as we think about the process to onboard new vendors or suppliers and what that looks like, that is a journey, and the insurance verification should be one step of it. Make sure if you're launching a program and you haven't done this before, that you're clearly communicating what's going on, why it's going on. You don't want anyone having a perspective that it's only them or that they're being singled out. Or that there's some dramatic change that's happening. Just an opportunity to be clear. Here's what we're doing, why we're doing it. We thank you in advance for your compliance, and have some of that messaging come, so they're not surprised when they see it for the first time or wondering, where it's out. Generally, if you're starting a program, you do that 2-ish weeks before you would start sending out requests to go collect information. And then finally, back to, the normal process. Given a couple of things, that you're going to constantly have churn in the vendor and supplier network, you're bringing on new, you're losing existing, and given that you're having what is most commonly a very distributed set of renewals across a year, that you end up with a process that's very fluid. And you want to think about that and the complexity of the individual actions that have to happen on a day-to-day basis, and make sure that's what's being put in place doesn't require any babysitting. So a quick case study here before we get to Q&A is around just an instance that we had where we were working with a Fortune 50 telecom retailer, and really were able to drive a 5% reduction in the corporate insurance rates because of the visibility and the assurances that they were able to provide to their broker associated with what they understood very clearly, very crisply, the risk to be. And that doesn't mean that there wasn't risk or there wasn't gaps in compliance with the suppliers or the vendors in this case that they were working with, but it did mean that they had a very good handle on it, and they were able to use that to ultimately reduce overall costs. So part of this is not getting necessarily purely to 100%, but getting that deep visibility, understanding kind of nuances at various levels about what the compliance is, and then driving to the right level of coverage and right level of your own risk mitigation, because you do much more clearly understand the risk that you're exposed to, and the amount of risk that you're actually able to transfer, because of, if that incident happened, that you can fall back to a policy from one of these third parties that you're associated with. And with that, we will go to questions. So if you have any questions, I actually forgot to mention this at the start of the call. There is a chat window. There is a question window. You can go in there and you can drop questions in, and we will go through them, time permitting. I think we've got another 10 minutes or so in the session today. And if we don't necessarily get to the questions, we will do our best to follow up and reach back out directly to give you answers best we can. Thank you guys. It looks like we've got questions starting to come in. So question number one: what happens if my supplier's contact info isn't accurate or reliable, or when the person I'm requesting a COI from isn't really the best person to respond to? So clearly this question comes from someone that's got some experience with going through and doing this, the insurance verification process. Obviously always a challenge when you're working with companies. They're going to have employee churn and turnover just like you do. And, who's there one day may take a, different role, a different position, and, you need a different contact. So there's a couple different approaches that we've seen be highly successful, but they vary based on the type of industry and the type of suppliers, the size of suppliers that you've got. So you're probably not a one size fits all, or even a one size fits all globally, or even a one size fits all for your specific population. We just thinking about this, we would start with 3 different recommendations. If you can, make sure that you have contact information not of a person, but of a department or group. So, if the company that you're working with has a compliance department, often that's more of a general type of mailbox, compliance@companyname.com, for example, where these sort of requests can come in, and then there's a team behind them that handles it, not kind of a single point of contact, a single mailbox that may not be viewed, or the person may have left, type of situation. So you get a good good view to get in and actually to see that, because there's just a team there. So that would be number one. That's kind of the ideal case, because as the supplier evolves, you don't have to be privy to it. You don't have to really worry about it. Case number 2 is you have multiple contacts, and this might be on the size of smaller organizations. You might have a business relationship contact that's responsible for things like this and keeping it up to date. That's obviously always ideal. You might have a accounts receivable, accounts payable type department, where there's not necessarily their job, but there's going to be someone there to monitor and be able to respond. You could include notification of multiple people when this is needed, and just have kind of a broader reach, and that could include just other individual contacts that you might have. So backup relationship managers, operational contacts that you might have as well. And then finally, step 3 is you really just don't know. We would recommend starting to go reach out and see where you have responses. So, if you really just don't know and you don't have kind of additional contacts, anything you've got is better than nothing. Start with that, see where you get the responses, take your time to kind of focus on the ones where you don't have responses. And maybe that's now where there's got to be a little bit more sleuth work, where you're digging in, making phone calls, or looking carefully on a case-by-case basis, and finding the exceptions. But what that really helps you do is narrow down the population that has to be more exception-based to a much smaller set, versus having to deal with the entire group out of the start before you get started. So you start to get good data in, and you start to, and part of the data points, even in this case, is where you don't have a response, where someone just hasn't responded, or the email even has bounced. Question 2. So there's another question that comes in. Let me read it, and then we'll digest it. my company operates in many different regions and countries. What's the easiest way to handle variation of insurance requirements? Yeah, that's a very good question. And certainly risk varies. The type of things that can be insured vary just because you have differences in laws as you start talking about different countries, as well as you have a very significant impact by just currency exchange rates. So what is good and standard for the U.S. may not work in many other places in the world, where having something as basic as $1 million of GL coverage, aggregate coverage, is an absorbent amount. So it's kind of a hard question to answer specifically without kind of knowing the dimensions, but it is certainly one that you would take a general view of saying, at a risk level, what is my risk exposed to, and what is a reasonable amount of risk that I could get covered. So the kind of the nice thing is, given the geographic spread, you're likely to have a high correlation between the risk that you would be exposed to and the more, I would say, custom amount of insurance that you would be able to get within that specific country. So like those 2 points end up being pretty highly correlated together and allow you to get down at a more nuanced level to make sure that you have the right protections there. There's another dimension to this question that's not specifically asked, or maybe it was and I just didn't interpret it as such. Maybe it's part of the regions, but even within a single country, you're likely to have variance based on the type of business that you might deal with. So if we took a retailer, for example, you have clearly suppliers in terms of the products that you're getting, the things that you're selling. But you also then have vendors that you might interact with that are offering services. And that might be a tech service, that might be a janitorial service, things like that. So the other thing to do is understand where you have variance in risk within what are the logical categories of the businesses that you interact with. So that could mean in some cases, which is perfectly acceptable, that there's limits are more set and negotiated though per contract. So, obviously as a company, you have a perspective on what sort of coverages you want, but, as part of the contract negotiation, you may get where there's different agreements as far as what the requirements need to be. So you really need to look kind of on an individual case by case basis. We make that super easy. So it's not, don't be afraid of that. It's just kind of the reality of how the relationships are established. Or you might have more categories to say, if you offer me this type of product, you have to have this. Or if you're this category of vendor, there has to be cyber coverage. You might have something like that would be part of the requirement. So, a couple different ways to slice and dice it, but it is trying to get it, as simple as you can make it for your business, whether that's by grouping or whether that's by understanding, where the variance is, and then kind of get down to get down to that level as far as how you're measuring in individual compliance. So starts to be a little bit more custom to the individual needs, which really works out well for the supplier because they're not having to comply with things that aren't applicable, and works well for you because you know that on an individual relationship basis that you have the risk that you've assessed covered in the right way. Great. There's one more question I see, which might fit perfectly in time. If there's anything else, please drop it in the question window and we'll see if we can squeeze it in. But the question that I've got here is, we find ourselves handling so many errors and exceptions. How can we handle those situations? This is actually a very fair problem. Something that we see pretty commonly too, which is one of the motivations that we have to kind of get into the space and try to address some of the pain points that are out there. But it's you kind of start off with just the messy process of having to reach out, collect some evidence in the form of a COI, do an assessment associated with it. In the case that there's non-compliant, reach back out. there's just a lot. There's a lot there. There's a lot of business process. There's a lot of business workflow, and there's a lot of opportunity when you have that many steps for things to get dropped and lost and not properly communicated or understood. And it is just a, in itself, there's a lot to kind of handle and lot to tackle there. So it may seem, pretty straightforward. Hey, we'll send a bunch of emails out, we'll get in, responses, and we'll kind of just archive things that way. Certainly that is an approach that, you could work. But I think the reality of just the scope and the size of the, I would say just the business process of getting engagement, with so many different individual entities around, so much nuance, is tricky, and you probably need something a little bit more systemic, to be able to do that, to be able to track status, to be able to make sure that you're getting things back in a way that are proper and effective. So, I think, in this case, there's tons of opportunity for automation. Whether you try to put some in yourself or you look for opportunities that are out there as far as third parties, there's a handful of different vendors that are doing it. We'd love to have a conversation with you about that, understand specifically your pain points, and understand, if we could do anything to offer you a, much easier approach, much simpler approach to going out and doing that. So, feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to have a conversation. And with that, we will wrap it up. And just to close on, kind of extending that topic conveniently enough, what we just talked about, we've really focused on these 4 key areas as specific pain points that we feel have great opportunity to help simplify and automate your risk compliant process around insurance. So number 1 is deep visibility. So, get in and normalize the data off of the COIs, be able to have very nuanced analysis and understanding of where the coverages are. So, you're not putting a human behind it. You're putting this in a, systemic programmatic approach that's going to tell you exactly where you have gaps, what the gaps are, and do it at a level of granularity that gives you great insight, into what your true risk is. So again, the goal is not necessarily to get to 100% compliance, like we clearly want that, but making sure that you understand when there's not compliance, what is the risk, because it's not binary. You may have some coverage, you may have most of the coverage that you need. There's one thing that makes it at a binary level not compliant. Getting to that level of detail is extremely important. Automation. So having just out of the box, simplified engagement with the supplier or vendors, automatic follow-ups when there's an expiration or non-compliant, engaging people, sending the reminders, offering you the right integration as well is essential, and putting that in place in a way that that happens. Making sure that you have what you need to get to yes, and this is more aligned with kind of that idea of getting to compliance. So when things are going to change, when there's renewals that are happening, make it as easy as possible. Again, kind of thinking about more akin to kind of a consumer journey with a product or a service. Just make it easy, right? They may not understand some of the needs. They may not be overly happy with their broker. Give them other options to go fulfill. Give them the easy button to be able to go do that. So if they have a gap, they can go assess and get that coverage wherever the gap is. And then finally, optimization. So having the right analytics and analysis and visibility to that data, where you can go and you can truly understand where you have excess coverage, where you have gaps, and what you need to do to drive and evolve your risk compliance program over time. A risk standard is not, a baseline, and often, especially when you're setting it for the first time without the visibility of where you have that coverage or that compliance, you may run into some challenges to know what needs to change and what the differences need to be, as far as adjustments to the policy, whether that's increasing or reducing coverage. Just giving you the insight and analysis of that, and then being able to take this data, this deep, comprehensive data, and bring it to the brokers to help reduce your costs, your own insurance costs over time. is an essential aspect of putting a program like this in place. It's clearly managing risk, reducing risk, reducing the overall liability, but then finding ways to then save from a your internal spend standpoint on your own insurance. And with that, we'll wrap it up. If you do have any other questions or you want to reach out, you can always find us at www.evidentid.com. And we'll be happy to engage in a conversation, understand some of the pain points, and see if we can do anything to help assist you in your compliance journey. I want to thank everyone for the time today, and hope you all have a great afternoon, and look forward to hearing from you.